A racist cop tried to choke a black judge inside the courtroom. Pure hatred. Pure abuse of power. He wanted to remind her, in the most brutal way possible, that she did not belong there. That no black woman should ever sit on the bench, ruling over men like him. His hands, rough and full of rage, tightened around her throat, cutting off her air, pressing against her windpipe with the full force of his unchecked authority. The room froze. A courtroom filled with people, yet silence wrapped around the moment like a noose. No one moved. No one dared. The same people who had watched her command respect minutes ago now stared, paralyzed, as she gasped for breath. As if part of them believed this was inevitable. As if deep down, they had expected this. His voice, low and venomous, slithered into her ear. "You don't get to tell me what to do." A cruel smirk twisted his lips, eyes burning with a sick pleasure. This wasn't just about power. It was about humiliation. It was about stripping her of everything she had built, reducing her to nothing more than a black woman begging for mercy. He wanted to break her, to remind her that no amount of education, no title, no robe could protect her from men like him. But he underestimated her. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of justice. A place where the law reigned above all. But in that moment, justice was suffocating under the weight of his grip. She felt her vision blur, the edges of the world turning dark, but she refused to let it end like this. He had spent his life bending the law to his will, twisting the system to crush people who looked like her. But today, the system wouldn't save him. With every ounce of strength left in her body, she fought back. A twist. A strike. A shift of weight. The same force he had used against her was now his undoing. Within seconds, his body crashed against the cold marble floor, arms pinned in a grip so tight his breath hitched. Panic flooded his face, the same panic he had forced onto countless others, the same terror they had felt under his boots, under his gun, under his badge. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it was like to be powerless. Gasps echoed through the room. The jury. The lawyers. The spectators. Every single one of them watched in horror, in awe, in disbelief. The judge who had just moments ago been at the mercy of this man now held him completely at hers. The balance had shifted. And suddenly, the weight of the law, of consequences, of karma, crashed down upon him with the force of a lifetime of injustices coming back to collect their debt. And then, the doors burst open. More officers. More men in blue. Their hands flew to their weapons, eyes wide with shock, their world flipped upside down. Their brother in arms was on the floor, struggling, gasping, his authority shattered. And standing over him, the woman he had sworn to destroy. Everything in the room teetered on a knife's edge. Would they cover for him? Would they twist the story like they always did, turning her into the villain? Would they claim she attacked first, ignoring the bruises around her neck, the deep red marks of his violence? Or would the truth finally break through the walls of their silence? And then, something happened. Something none of them saw coming. Something that left every single person in that courtroom speechless. And when it was over, one thing was clear, justice had never tasted so cold. But what exactly happened that left everyone in complete shock? Stay until the end of this story to find out. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice. This story is not just a piece of fiction, it's a reflection of real struggles that many people face every day. If you've ever been mistreated, underestimated, or silenced, know that your voice matters, your life matters, and your fight is worth it. This channel is a safe space for stories that empower, challenge, and inspire. Stay strong. Stay proud. Stay resilient. Now, sit back and enjoy this powerful story. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel and join us for more intense, thought-provoking narratives. Let's get into it. The city of Chicago had seen its fair share of injustice. It carried a history heavy with battles fought in courtrooms and in the streets. A city where power had long been defined by the color of one's skin and the badge one carried. But for Judge Aaliyah Carter, the fight was personal. She wasn't just another black woman in a position of authority, she was a symbol of what the system had tried to erase for generations. She had earned her place through grit, through sleepless nights buried in legal textbooks, through every sideways glance and murmured insult in the corridors of the courthouse. She was the first black female judge in her district, and that alone made her a target. Aaliyah had grown up understanding that the world wasn't built for women like her. Raised on the South Side, she had watched her father, a civil rights lawyer, lose case after case against a justice system that seemed allergic to fairness. She had seen her mother, a school teacher, fight for underprivileged black kids who were written off before they even had a chance. She had felt the weight of being a Carter, of carrying a name that came with expectations, with responsibility. And she had delivered. She worked harder, spoke sharper, held her head higher. Because in a world that questioned her every move, excellence was her only defense. But even excellence couldn't protect her from men like Officer Travis Dalton. Dalton had been a cop for 15 years. 15 years of getting away with things that would have ruined another man. His uniform was his shield, his badge a weapon. He wasn't just any officer, he was a poster boy for the old guard, the kind of cop who saw black skin as a threat, who carried a quiet but dangerous resentment against anyone who challenged his authority. The kind of man who believed people like Aaliyah Carter didn't belong in positions of power. He had built a reputation for himself as untouchable, because the system protected men like him. For years, Dalton had operated under the belief that he was above the law. That the rules bent for men like him. That no one could touch him. And he had been right, until Aaliyah Carter stepped onto the bench. Their paths crossed in the worst way possible. It started with a case, a young black man falsely accused of armed robbery. The evidence against him was weak, the kind of case that should have never made it to trial. But Dalton had been the arresting officer, and he had made sure the charges stuck. He had twisted the narrative, manipulated witness statements, planted just enough doubt to make it seem plausible. He had done it a dozen times before. But this time, he was up against Aaliyah Carter. She saw through the lies immediately. The inconsistencies in the report. The missing surveillance footage. The lost body cam recordings. She had spent her entire career dissecting cases like these, exposing the cracks in a system designed to fail people who looked like her. And she wasn't about to let it happen again. The moment she dismissed the case, the moment she ruled in favor of the innocent, Dalton knew she was a problem. He felt it deep in his bones, the rage, the humiliation. He had walked into that courtroom expecting his version of the story to be the final word. Expected to leave with his authority unquestioned, his reputation intact. Instead, he had been challenged, undermined, by a black woman who dared to stand against him. That was when the hatred took root. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about what she represented. Dalton began watching her. He paid attention to every ruling, every decision, every case she presided over. He saw her siding with justice in a way that didn't align with his world, because in his world, justice was never meant to be fair. It was meant to be controlled. And she was disrupting that control. The resentment grew. He started whispering about her in precinct hallways, planting doubts in the minds of his fellow officers. She's got an agenda. She's trying to make us look bad. She's dangerous. It didn't take much to stoke the flames, because the fear was already there. Fear of a black woman with power. Fear of someone who couldn't be intimidated, bribed, or controlled. Then, one day, his opportunity came. The courthouse was packed that afternoon. A high-profile case, media swarming like vultures, eyes locked on every move inside the courtroom. It was the perfect moment for a lesson to be taught. A lesson about who really held power in that building. As the gavel struck, as Aaliyah Carter stood firm in her ruling, Dalton made his move. She barely saw it coming. 1 second, she was descending from the bench, the weight of justice heavy on her shoulders. The next, a hand wrapped around her throat. It wasn't a shove. It wasn't a grab. It was an execution grip. Deliberate. Calculated. A man who had done this before, who knew exactly how much pressure to apply, how much force it took to make someone submit. The entire courtroom froze. The lawyers. The jury. The spectators. No one moved. Because in that moment, it was no longer about law. No longer about the courtroom, the titles, the power she was supposed to have. It was about something far older, far more primal. It was about a black woman's life in the hands of a white man who thought he could do whatever he wanted. Dalton leaned in, his voice a low, seething whisper. You don't get to tell me how to do my job. You don't get to be here. Aaliyah couldn't breathe. Couldn't speak. Could only hear the blood pounding in her ears, feel the weight of every injustice that had ever been done to people like her. And she knew, no one was coming to save her. But Dalton didn't expect one thing. She fought back. A shift in weight. A calculated twist. The same force he used against her turned against him. The room flipped in an instant. And before anyone could process what was happening, the unthinkable occurred. Dalton, the untouchable cop, the man who had walked above the law for years, was suddenly the one gasping for breath. Pinned. Overpowered. Weak. And then, something happened. Something that left everyone in that courtroom completely, utterly speechless. And when it was over, nothing would ever be the same again. The entire courtroom was a maelstrom of tension, an atmosphere so thick with unease that it felt like breathing in pure static. The moment had spiraled into something none of them had expected, something so impossible, so unthinkable, that even those who had spent years in that building, who had seen countless cases of injustice, who had watched black men and women be dragged out in cuffs for far less, stood paralyzed by the sheer audacity of what had just transpired. A judge, a black female judge, had just overpowered a white police officer in open court, in front of an audience of lawyers, jurors, clerks, and officials who had built their careers on the very laws that had been shattered in an instant. No one moved. No one dared. It was as if the weight of history had crashed down upon them all, pressing into their lungs, suffocating them with the realization that the balance of power had shifted in a way that none of them had ever expected to see with their own eyes. Aaliyah Carter's pulse thundered in her ears, her grip still tight around Dalton's wrist, the heat of his skin burning beneath her fingers as he struggled beneath her hold. His breath was jagged, raw, each inhale laced with the unmistakable panic of a man who had never known what it felt like to be powerless. His body trembled beneath her grasp, his usual arrogance crumbling under the pressure of being on the receiving end of his own brutality. His free hand clawed at the marble floor, his muscles twitching as if still trying to process the reality of his situation, the horror of what was happening to him, the horror of being seen like this, weak, vulnerable, pinned down by a woman who had spent her entire career being told she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, worthy enough to sit in the seat of power that she had rightfully earned. He wasn't just afraid. He was humiliated. But the moment of control, the moment where Aaliyah had finally, for the first time in her life, turned the tables, where the weight of centuries of oppression seemed to shift for even a fleeting second, was fleeting. The doors to the courtroom burst open so violently that the walls seemed to tremble from the force, the sharp crack of leather shoes and heavy boots slamming against polished marble cutting through the stunned silence. More officers. More men in blue. They flooded in, their hands flying to their holsters, their fingers twitching over the triggers of their weapons, eyes darting from the scene before them to each other, to their leader, a brother in arms now beneath a woman who had dared to put him there. Aaliyah barely had a moment to register the way the room had tilted against her, the way every set of eyes had locked onto her, not in admiration, not in relief, but in something colder, something more dangerous, something that sent a chilling realization down the length of her spine. It didn't matter what had happened. It didn't matter that she had been the one fighting for her life, that she had been attacked, that she had merely defended herself against the weight of a system designed to crush her where she stood. None of that mattered. Because all they saw, all they would ever see, was that a black woman had laid hands on a white cop. A voice, sharp, commanding, cut through the heavy air. "Judge Carter, stand down. Right now." The words crashed against her like a tidal wave, the force of them sending a cold, shivering pulse through her veins. But she didn't move. Not yet. Dalton let out a slow, shaky breath, his limbs still struggling beneath her, but now, something else had returned to his expression. The fear was still there, yes. But so was something else, something older, something darker. The kind of malicious glee that only a man who had lived his entire life untouched by consequence could muster. The kind of smug satisfaction that could only come from knowing that no matter what had just happened, no matter how humiliating it had been, he was still the one who would walk out of that room untouched, unscathed, and victorious. He shifted beneath her, the tension still tight in his body, but his lips curled upward, the ghost of a smirk creeping onto his face even as he wiped sweat from his forehead, even as pain flickered in his features. His voice was low, hoarse from the struggle, but still carrying the weight of a man who knew he still owned the game, no matter how close he had come to losing it. "You're done." The words slithered from his mouth, an oath, a promise, a curse. The arrogance in them burned, a cruel reminder that this wasn't over, that it wouldn't be over until he said so. And Aaliyah knew it. Knew it deep in her bones, in the marrow of her existence. He wasn't just making a threat. He was making a vow. The officers advanced now, closing in on her with a slow, methodical purpose, like wolves circling their prey, their bodies shifting as if preparing for a fight, as if they were waiting for an excuse to turn this into something even worse, something deadly. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, controlled, measured, forcing the tremor out of her voice before she spoke, before she made sure they all knew that she was still in control, that they hadn't broken her. "Are you arresting me?" Silence. A hesitation, just brief enough to expose them. They had no legal grounds. They had no justification. But that didn't mean they wouldn't do it anyway. Dalton let out a low, dark chuckle, his chest still rising and falling from the effort of regaining himself, but now, the triumph was creeping back into his voice, thick and dripping with satisfaction. "Oh, we'll find a reason." The room seemed to contract around her, closing in like a noose tightening around her throat, but Aaliyah refused to let it show. Refused to let them see any flicker of hesitation, any sliver of fear. Because she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had spent her entire life believing that the system she worked for could be changed, could be repaired, could be restructured to work for the people who had been crushed beneath its weight for generations. But now, as she stood there, surrounded, accused, branded a criminal for daring to survive, she saw the truth clearer than ever. The system was not broken. It was never meant to work for people like her. And if Dalton thought that she was just going to accept this, if he thought that she would let him bury her under false charges, destroy her reputation, strip her of everything she had built, erase her like so many others before her, he was gravely mistaken. With slow, deliberate movements, she lifted her hands, not in surrender, but in control, in defiance. "I'll leave with you," she said, voice steady, unyielding, unwavering. "But I'm not saying another word without my lawyer." Dalton's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching as if the control was slipping from him again, as if he hated the fact that even now, even after everything, she was still holding power over him. The officers closed in, their presence heavy around her, her entire world narrowing into the suffocating weight of being escorted out under suspicion, under judgment, under the crushing, unbearable truth that they would stop at nothing to destroy her. But they had no idea. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because what was coming next would change everything. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in, thick with an unspoken hostility that lingered in the cold, fluorescent glow overhead. The air was stale, carrying the weight of too many broken confessions, too many deals cut behind these same steel-gray walls. The table between them was scratched, battered from years of fists slamming in frustration, pens carving silent protests into the surface, a monument to every injustice that had passed through this room. Aaliyah Carter sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture betraying none of the storm raging beneath her skin. Across from her, Travis Dalton leaned back in his chair, arms folded over his chest, his lip curling into a smirk dripping with arrogance, the same smug confidence he always carried. His bruised wrist was still red, a reminder of what had happened in that courtroom, a reminder of the single moment where his power had slipped through his fingers like sand. But now, he thought he had it back. Silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating, a battle of wills playing out in the weight of unsaid words. Then he broke it. You know, he mused, voice lazy, like he was enjoying this, stretching out the moment like a cat playing with a wounded bird. I gotta hand it to you. I didn't think you had it in you. That was impressive, really. Putting me on the ground like that. You've got some fight in you. His smirk widened, his fingers tapping against the table rhythmically, slow and calculated, his eyes narrowing. But you and I both know it doesn't matter. Not really. Aaliyah didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She kept her breathing even, controlled, her pulse steady, because she knew what he was doing. Dalton chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. See, here's the thing, Judge Carter. You can play tough all you want, sit there with your lawyer on speed dial, act like this is just another case you can manipulate with that sharp little mind of yours. But let's be real, you're done. He leaned forward then, his voice dropping lower, filled with something colder, something uglier. I told you, didn't I? I told you I'd find a reason. Her jaw tightened. He was enjoying this. Dalton exhaled sharply, a sound that was almost amused, almost pitying. You really think the system is gonna save you? He let the question hang in the air, watching her, waiting, relishing the power of it. I've been doing this a long time, sweetheart. I know how this works. I've watched this city chew up people just like you and spit them out like they never existed. His fingers drummed the table once more, his head tilting slightly, as if he were contemplating her fate like a king passing judgment. You put your hands on a cop in front of a room full of witnesses. You're a black woman in America. And you're gonna sit there and tell me you think you're walking out of this? Aaliyah finally leaned forward, just slightly, her eyes never leaving his, the slow, deliberate shift in her position sending a subtle but clear message. You really think I don't know what you are, Travis? Her voice was smooth, even, but laced with steel, sharp enough to cut through his bravado like a blade pressed to the throat. You think I haven't seen 100 men just like you? You've spent your whole life thinking that badge gives you the right to do whatever you want. That no matter what happens, someone will clean up your mess, protect you, make it all disappear. She exhaled slowly, watching the flicker of irritation tighten his features. But you made a mistake. Dalton's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but she caught it. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table, mirroring his own arrogance back at him, and she let the words roll out slow, deliberate. You did it in front of the wrong person. Dalton scoffed, but there was a shift now, a flicker of something beneath his skin, something that wasn't quite as confident, not as controlled. He shook his head, laughing under his breath, but the amusement didn't quite reach his eyes. And what, you think your little legal tricks are gonna fix this? That's cute. His hand clenched slightly against the table, his knuckles turning white for just a second before he forced himself to relax again. They already started spinning the story, Carter. The department's got the media in their pocket. By tomorrow morning, this is gonna be a whole different story. And guess what? You're the villain. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, her gaze cold and calculating. And what happens when the tape gets out? Dalton froze. Just for a second. Just long enough for Aaliyah to see it, the crack in his armor, the sudden flash of realization that he hadn't accounted for everything. She smiled then, just slightly, her voice soft, deadly. "Oh. You didn't know." She leaned forward just enough for her words to hit him like a bullet to the chest, slow and steady. "The cameras in that courtroom don't just record audio, Travis. They catch everything. Every angle. Every move. Every second of you putting your hands around my throat." Silence. Pure. Paralyzing. Silence. Dalton's breathing hitched, barely noticeable, but enough for her to see the walls closing in on him. His fingers twitched, his posture stiffened, and suddenly, he wasn't the one in control anymore. She sat back, exhaling slowly, savoring the moment, the shift, the sheer delicious irony of watching a man who had spent his entire life untouchable realize that his time had run out. "So tell me," she said smoothly, tapping the table once, watching as his confidence drained from his face, as the color in his cheeks darkened with something that almost looked like panic. "Who do you think they're gonna believe?" Dalton clenched his jaw so tight she could almost hear his teeth grind together, his nostrils flaring as the weight of his mistake crashed down on him like an avalanche. And in that moment, Aaliyah Carter knew. He wasn't the one holding the power anymore. She was. And this? This was only the beginning. Dalton's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The confidence that had been radiating off him, that smug, untouchable arrogance, was cracking at the seams, splitting apart like a dam about to burst. His breathing had changed, shallow, uneven, his muscles locked so tightly that his jaw clenched with the effort of containing the sheer panic rising inside him. Aaliyah watched it happen, watched as the weight of the situation pressed down on him like an iron grip around his throat, the same way he had tried to do to her just hours ago. The irony was almost poetic. For the first time since this had begun, Dalton was afraid. She let that moment sit, let it breathe, let him feel it deep in his chest, the slow, suffocating realization that he wasn't the one holding the cards anymore. Then she spoke, her voice so calm, so precise, so calculated, that it sent a slow ripple of unease through his already unraveling composure. "You thought you could control the story," she murmured, watching him carefully, her words slow, deliberate, dripping with the weight of certainty. "You thought you could twist it, spin it, bury the truth like you always have. You thought you could walk away from this untouched, just like every time before." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his, holding him right where she wanted him, refusing to let him look away, to escape what was coming. "But you made a mistake, Travis." She let that sink in, let the words settle deep in the space between them, before she delivered the final blow. "You got caught." Dalton exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers twitching against the table, his knee bouncing slightly in a barely restrained show of nerves. He shook his head, a weak laugh escaping his throat, but there was no humor in it, no real confidence behind the sound. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but it wasn't as firm as before. It wasn't conviction. It was desperation. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, studying him, reading every micro-expression, every subtle shift in his demeanor. He was trying to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince her. And she knew it. "You're bluffing," he snapped suddenly, his voice sharper now, angrier, but not controlled, not the way it had been before. "If there was a tape, if there was any footage that actually showed what happened, you wouldn't be sitting here. You'd already be using it. You'd already have the press on this, the DA, every damn activist in the city screaming for my badge." He laughed again, but this time it was forced, hollow, like he was holding onto a ledge that was crumbling beneath him. "There's nothing. You have nothing." Aaliyah let the silence stretch for a long moment, let him sit in his own unraveling confidence, let him feel the uncertainty creeping in, poisoning the last remnants of his certainty. Then she spoke. "Oh, but I do." Dalton went still. Completely still. His eyes flickered, just for a second, but she saw it, the doubt, the fear, the sheer terror of knowing that for the first time, he didn't have control over the outcome. She inhaled slowly, her hands calmly folded together on the table, her voice smooth as glass, carrying the precise weight of a woman who knew she had already won. Courtrooms have cameras, Travis. They catch everything. Every movement. Every sound. And guess what? The moment you put your hands on me, the moment you wrapped your fingers around my throat, they were rolling. She let the words hang there, let them settle deep in his gut, let him feel them coil around his spine like a vice. And now, so is the entire country. Dalton's breath hitched, his throat working as he swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists against the table, his face drained of color. "You're lying," he forced out, but the cracks in his voice betrayed him. Aaliyah just smiled. "Am I?" His mind was spinning now, racing, trying to calculate, trying to determine if she was bluffing, trying to piece together an escape route that no longer existed. He had spent his whole career building an empire of fear, of unchecked power, of abusing the system to his advantage, but now? Now he was sitting in a chair he had forced so many others into, facing the exact same weight of judgment he had inflicted onto countless others. His breathing quickened, the realization hitting him like a freight train. She had him. For the first time in his life, he was trapped. Aaliyah could see it sinking in, could feel the sheer weight of justice pressing down on him, feel the shift in power as it settled firmly in her hands. And she wasn't going to waste it. She leaned forward, her tone soft but deadly, unshakable, final. "Your department isn't gonna save you this time," she whispered, letting the words drip like poison into the silence. "Your friends aren't gonna be able to clean this up, rewrite the story, erase what happened. Because this time, the whole world is watching. And there's nothing you can do to stop it." Dalton's hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white, his nostrils flaring, his face twisting into something between rage and terror, but he had no comeback, no snide remark, no last-ditch effort to claw his way out of this one. Because there was nothing left for him to say. Aaliyah watched as the walls of his carefully constructed reality crumbled around him, piece by piece, brick by brick, his entire world falling apart right in front of him. And it was glorious. She sat back slowly, exhaling, letting the silence sit, letting him drown in the sheer weight of his own downfall. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out her phone, and placed it face down on the table. Dalton's eyes snapped to it instantly, suspicion swirling in the panic now rising behind his gaze. Aaliyah smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the unshakable certainty of a woman who had spent her life waiting for this moment, for this kind of justice, for this kind of reckoning. "Go ahead," she murmured, tapping the phone lightly. "Watch the news." And in that moment, as the world outside erupted with the story that would end his career, his life, his legacy of unchecked power, Dalton finally understood. He had lost. And Aaliyah Carter? She had won. Justice had arrived. The silence in the interrogation room had become something alive, stretching out between them like an untamed force, suffocating in its intensity. Travis Dalton wasn't speaking anymore. He wasn't smirking, wasn't taunting, wasn't trying to control the narrative. Because the narrative had been ripped from his hands, and he knew it. His entire body had stiffened, a man who had built his life on the illusion of invincibility, now sitting under the crushing weight of undeniable reality. His world, his untouchable existence, was shattering in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had lost. Aaliyah Carter didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The sheer power of the moment was enough. She sat perfectly still, her breathing even, her expression unreadable. But inside, she felt the storm raging, the culmination of years of watching men like him twist the law into a weapon, the slow-burning anger of every injustice that had gone unanswered. And now, justice was here, staring him in the face with a reckoning so absolute that even he couldn't pretend to be unaffected. Her phone lay face down on the metal table between them, but they both knew what was on it. The news had already spread like wildfire. Every major outlet, every journalist with integrity, every voice that had been silenced by the system was now speaking louder than ever. The footage from the courtroom had leaked, Dalton's own arrogance had sealed his fate. His hands around her throat, his rage, his violence, the raw, unfiltered moment where he had crossed the line with the whole world watching. Dalton's breathing had changed. It wasn't the measured, arrogant confidence he had carried when she first sat across from him. It wasn't the cocky, untouchable smirk he had worn like armor. It was something else now, something more desperate. Shallow, uneven, the sound of a man drowning in the consequences of his own actions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it was the first honest thing he had said all night. This isn't how it was supposed to go. Aaliyah didn't blink. No. Dalton exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, a movement so tense it looked like he was trying to ground himself, trying to hold on to whatever thread of control he still had left. His hands trembled slightly as they dropped back to the table, and she knew then, he wasn't just losing his career, he was losing everything. The shield of protection he had always relied on, the silent codes between men like him that had kept him safe, kept him above the law, was breaking apart. His voice was quieter now, but still laced with something raw, something bitter. Do you really think this is justice? He didn't look at her when he said it, just stared at the edge of the table, his fingers twitching as if trying to hold on to an argument that was already slipping away. You think this fixes anything? You think the system is gonna change just because one bad cop finally gets what's coming to him? He let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head, his face twisted in something between resentment and disbelief. They'll throw me to the wolves, sure. I'll be the scapegoat. They'll let me burn so they can save face. But the rest of them? The ones just like me? The ones that don't get caught on camera? He finally looked at her then, his eyes sharp but hollow. They'll keep doing what they do. Aaliyah didn't look away. She didn't let his words rattle her. Because she had heard it all before. The argument that justice was never enough. The belief that if you couldn't fix everything at once, then maybe you shouldn't try at all. But she wasn't here for theoretical debates. She was here because this moment mattered. She inhaled, slow and deliberate, before speaking. Her voice didn't waver. So that's your excuse? Her gaze held steady, unwavering, a mirror to the emptiness she saw in him. You justify what you've done by convincing yourself that it never really mattered. That because the system is flawed, your part in it was inevitable. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto his, refusing to let him escape what he had become. You don't get to pretend to be some tragic figure caught in a corrupt system, Dalton. You were the corruption. He didn't answer. But his silence spoke louder than words ever could. Aaliyah sat back, watching him sit in the weight of his own downfall. Maybe the system won't change overnight, she continued, her voice measured, even. Maybe men like you will always exist in some form. But today. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. Today, at least, one of you won't walk away unscathed. Dalton let out another breath, but this time, it wasn't sharp or defensive. It was just, empty. Like something inside of him had finally accepted it. The door creaked open behind them. An officer stepped inside. But this time, he wasn't here to protect Dalton. The DA's office just called, the officer announced, voice neutral, professional. Formal charges are being filed. You're being taken into custody. Dalton barely reacted. He just stared at the table, the reality crashing over him in slow, agonizing waves. Aaliyah stood slowly, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer, standing tall as she took in the sight of the man who had tried to destroy her, silence her, erase her, now sitting in the exact position he had put so many others in. She turned toward the door, her heels clicking against the floor as she walked out, leaving Dalton to his fate. And as she stepped into the hallway, the cameras flashing, the reporters shouting, the world finally seeing the truth for what it was, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about her. This was about something bigger. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. But this wasn't over yet. Because the real question was, what would happen next? The air outside the station was thick with noise, a chaotic storm of flashing lights, shouting reporters, and the low hum of gathered onlookers who had come to witness history unfold in real time. The weight of the moment pressed down on everything, each movement feeling slower, heavier, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The cameras pointed in every direction, news crews scrambling to capture the downfall of a man who had once walked these same streets with absolute power, a man who had operated above the law, now reduced to nothing more than another criminal being led into custody. Aaliyah Carter stood at the top of the courthouse steps, the world flashing in front of her, voices overlapping, questions firing from every direction. She should have felt victorious. She should have felt something. But all she felt was the weight of everything that had come before this moment. The exhaustion of a battle that had lasted her entire career, her entire life. This wasn't just about Dalton. It never had been. It was about every man like him who had never faced consequences. Every abuse of power that had been swept under the rug. Every life ruined, every family destroyed, every victim who never got their justice. The reporters were relentless. Judge Carter, how do you feel knowing you took down a decorated officer? Do you think this case will finally lead to real police reform? Are you afraid for your safety after today? The questions kept coming, but she didn't answer. Not yet. Not until she had something worth saying. Instead, she stood there, watching as the officers led Dalton out of the building, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face pale, his expression unreadable. For the first time in his life, there was no badge to protect him. No system bending in his favor. No powerful friends pulling strings in the background to make it all disappear. He was just another man in handcuffs now. Just another name in the system he had helped corrupt. Their eyes met for the briefest second. There was no anger left in him now, no smugness, no arrogance. Only the realization that this was real. That it was happening. Aaliyah wasn't sure what she had expected. Maybe some final outburst, some desperate attempt at reclaiming control. Maybe a muttered curse, a whispered threat, something to remind her of who he had been before all of this unraveled. But there was nothing. Just silence. And then, he was gone, shoved into the back of a police vehicle, the door slamming shut behind him. She exhaled slowly, then turned back toward the press. One question stood out among the rest, rising above the noise, cutting through everything. Do you believe justice has finally been served? Aaliyah felt the weight of that question settle over her shoulders like a storm cloud. She thought about the families that had never seen justice, the names that had faded into statistics, the pain that lingered in the cracks of a system too broken to be fixed with one arrest. She thought about the black mothers who still had to teach their children how to survive encounters with men like Dalton. She thought about how many people had fought this fight before her and how many would still be fighting it long after she was gone. So she answered. Not with victory. Not with celebration. But with the truth. This is a start, she said simply, her voice calm, steady, but carrying the full weight of her conviction. But it's not the end. The crowd erupted, some voices pushing further, trying to pull more from her, but she had said what needed to be said. She didn't stay to bask in the moment. There was still too much left to do. She turned and walked away, leaving them all behind. Inside the courthouse, she made her way back to her office, her footsteps the only sound in the empty hallway. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving behind the bone-deep exhaustion of everything that had happened. She reached her door, pushed it open, stepped inside. And then, finally, she let out the breath she had been holding. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Marcus Green, one of the only officers in the department she actually trusted. He was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable, his posture tense. "I thought you might want to know," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Dalton's already trying to make a deal." Aaliyah felt something cold settle in her chest. Of course he was. Men like Dalton didn't just accept consequences. They fought them. Even now, even after everything, he still thought he could manipulate the system. "What kind of deal?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral, even though she already knew where this was going. Marcus let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "He's offering names. Corruption inside the department. Officers who covered for him, who covered for others. He's willing to expose everything, if it gets him a lighter sentence." Aaliyah sat back, letting that sink in. Dalton wasn't loyal to anyone but himself. If he was going down, he was taking as many people with him as possible. She should have felt some kind of satisfaction. Should have felt something at the idea that this could lead to something bigger. But she didn't trust it. "Not yet." "Do you think the DA will take it?" she asked. Marcus hesitated. "They're considering it. He knows things, Carter. Things that could bring a lot of people down." She exhaled slowly, thinking through the consequences of what this could mean. If Dalton really had information that could expose deeper corruption, then this fight wasn't over. Not even close. She had won the battle. But now? Now, she had to decide how far she was willing to go to win the war. And something told her, this was only the beginning. The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air like a blade suspended between them, sharp, dangerous, threatening to cut if handled the wrong way. Aaliyah Carter sat perfectly still, her fingers pressed lightly together, her mind already racing through the implications of what this meant. Dalton was willing to turn on his own people. To save himself, he was ready to drag the entire department into the light, to expose the network of corruption that had protected men like him for years. And that meant she had a choice to make. Marcus watched her carefully, his expression unreadable, but she could feel the tension rolling off of him in waves. He had been in this system long enough to know that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. There was no guarantee that Dalton's offer would lead to anything real. No promise that the men in power wouldn't find a way to bury the truth before it ever saw daylight. And yet, there was something about this moment that felt different. Finally, Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, as if trying to release some of the weight pressing down on her chest. Her voice was calm, but beneath it was something cold, something steady, something that refused to break. "What exactly is he offering?" Marcus hesitated. "Names. High-ranking officers. Judges. Prosecutors. People with power. He claims he can connect them all, show exactly how deep this runs." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "If it's true, it could blow everything wide open." Aaliyah tapped her fingers against the desk, her mind working through the possibilities, the risks. If Dalton had real proof, not just names, but evidence, this wasn't just a case anymore. This was an earthquake waiting to happen. But she had been in this game long enough to know that men like Dalton didn't offer up their allies unless they had no other way out. That meant he was desperate. That meant he was afraid. That meant he was dangerous. She let the silence stretch between them before finally speaking. "And what does he want in return?" Marcus let out a sharp breath, his expression twisting into something grim. "A reduced sentence. Maybe even a plea deal that keeps him out of prison altogether." Aaliyah's jaw tightened. Of course. Dalton had spent years destroying lives, and now he wanted a free pass just because he had finally run out of options. He wanted to be the hero in the very story he had helped create, to rewrite himself as a man who had simply been caught up in the wrong system, rather than one of the architects who built it. She shook her head, her voice flat, unwavering. "Absolutely not." Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Carter, if what he's saying is true, I don't care," she cut in, her voice sharper now, the frustration creeping in, the sheer exhaustion of everything pressing against her ribcage like a weight that refused to lift. I don't care how much he knows. I don't care how many names he's willing to throw under the bus. He doesn't get to walk away from this. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Marcus's, making sure he understood exactly what she was saying. He doesn't get to do what he did, to me, to the people in this city, to everyone he's ever terrorized, and then just erase it all because he finally decided to talk. Marcus held her gaze for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. She could tell he agreed with her. But she also knew that it wasn't that simple. The DA is considering it, he said finally, his voice reluctant, like he already knew how she was going to react. Aaliyah felt a sharp, cold rage spark inside her, burning deep, slow, controlled, but powerful enough to feel like it could ignite at any second. Of course they were. The same system that had protected Dalton for years was now willing to use him for their own benefit, to trade one form of corruption for another, to cut a deal that would keep them from having to truly face the depth of what they had allowed to happen. She shook her head slowly, pushing herself up from the chair, her movements deliberate, controlled, but her pulse was pounding in her ears. Where is he now? Marcus frowned. Holding cell. Waiting for the DA's decision. Aaliyah didn't hesitate. Take me to him. Marcus hesitated for just a second before nodding, stepping aside to let her pass. The walk to the holding area was long, the hall stretched out like a tunnel with no clear end, no clear exit. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of everything pressing against her shoulders, the knowledge that this wasn't just about Dalton anymore. This was about what kind of justice she truly believed in. When they reached the door, Marcus glanced at her one last time, a silent question in his eyes. Are you sure you want to do this? She answered by pushing the door open and stepping inside. Dalton was sitting at the metal table in the center of the room, his hands no longer cuffed, but he looked smaller now, diminished, like the weight of what was coming had finally started to settle in his bones. He didn't smirk this time. Didn't posture. He just looked up at her, waiting. Aaliyah closed the door behind her, walking slowly to the chair across from him, lowering herself into it with a patience that felt like a warning. She studied him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between them, making sure he felt every second of it. Then she finally spoke, her voice steady, controlled, but carrying a sharpness that cut through the air like a blade. You don't get to rewrite this story, Dalton. His jaw tensed. I'm not trying to rewrite anything. Aaliyah leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked onto his, refusing to let him look away. A reduced sentence. A plea deal. You think this erases what you've done? You think this makes you a good man? Dalton exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I'm not asking for a free pass. But if you actually care about taking down the people who let this happen, you'll take the deal. His voice had an edge to it now, like he knew he was playing his last card, like he knew this was his only way out. Because without me, you don't have a case. Without me, they keep their jobs. They keep their power. Nothing changes. Aaliyah felt a cold anger coil in her chest, something deep, something ancient, something that had been building inside her for years. Nothing changes because men like you make sure of it. Dalton's hands clenched slightly against the table, his frustration finally breaking through the cracks. And what, you think locking me up fixes it? You think throwing me in a cell makes the world right again? She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Then, finally, she leaned back, her expression unreadable. No, she admitted, her voice quieter now, but still firm. But it's a start. Dalton didn't answer. Because they both knew she was right. She pushed back from the table, standing slowly, looking down at him one last time. You'll get what you deserve, Dalton. And so will they. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving him to sit in the silence of his own consequences. Because justice was coming. And this time, It wouldn't stop with just one man. The courtroom was silent, but it wasn't the same silence that had existed before. This was a different kind of silence, one that carried weight, one that sat heavy on the shoulders of everyone present, pressing down with the force of truth that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from fear, it was the kind of silence that followed a reckoning. The kind of silence that came before the fall of something that had once seemed untouchable. Aaliyah Carter stood at the front of it all, her posture straight, her expression calm, but inside, she could feel the storm of everything that had led to this moment still lingering beneath her skin. Dalton sat just feet away, no longer a man of authority, no longer protected by his badge, no longer carrying the arrogance that had once made him feel invincible. He was a prisoner now, shackled, waiting to hear the final words that would decide his fate. The trial had been swift, brutal in its exposure of truth. The footage had done exactly what Aaliyah knew it would, stripped away the lies, the protection, the manufactured stories that had kept him safe for years. His fellow officers had turned on him one by one, choosing their own survival over loyalty, each testimony another nail in his coffin. And now, after everything, after all the destruction he had caused, all the power he had wielded over people who had no way to fight back, the moment of judgment had finally arrived. The judge spoke, his voice firm, emotionless, carrying the weight of finality that Dalton had once held over others so easily. Life in prison. No parole. No deals. No escape. For the first time since this began, Dalton's face finally showed what he had spent his entire life avoiding, real, true fear. The kind that came not from knowing that something had gone wrong, but from knowing that nothing could ever be fixed. That this was it. That the system that had always been his shield was now the very thing burying him alive. He was led out of the courtroom in chains, and the moment the doors closed behind him, he ceased to exist in the world he once dominated. Aaliyah let out a slow breath, but there was no sense of triumph in it. Justice had been served, but justice was never simple. Because this wasn't just about one man, and it never had been. It was about every man like him, about the structures that had allowed him to rise, to abuse, to control. It was about what came next. And what came next was a fight that wasn't over. Dalton's testimony had ripped open the department from the inside, exposing a web of corruption so deep that the city was still unraveling from its impact. Judges, officers, officials, they were all falling like dominoes, dragged from their positions of power, forced to answer for what they had done in the shadows. Some were arrested. Some ran. Some tried to strike deals, but there were no deals left to make. The world was watching too closely now. The system had been forced into the light, and there was no hiding from it anymore. For Aaliyah, it meant more battles, more nights spent combing through evidence, more meetings with people who had once doubted her, now coming to her for guidance, for leadership. And she didn't shy away from it. Because this was what she had always fought for. Not just for one victory, not just for one conviction, but for something bigger. Something that would outlive her. And yet, not everything was destruction. Some things were finally being built in the ashes of what had fallen. Aaliyah found herself in spaces she had once only dreamed of occupying, sitting in meetings with those who actually had the power to change laws, to rewrite policies that had been weaponized against people like her for too long. She was no longer just a woman fighting against the tide. She was a force shaping it. The city changed. Not overnight, not completely, but enough. Enough to remind her that the fight had been worth it. And one evening, as she sat in her office, looking over new legislation that she had helped push forward, her phone buzzed with a message. A name she hadn't seen in a long time. Dalton. Not from him, of course. From a reporter covering his life inside prison. She hesitated for a long moment before opening it. It was an interview excerpt. "Do you regret anything?" the reporter had asked. Dalton had been silent for a long time before answering. "I regret thinking I could get away with it forever." Aaliyah stared at the words for a long moment. Then, slowly, she set the phone down. And she moved on. Because his story was over. And hers was just beginning. But now, let's take a moment to reflect. This story, as shocking as it may seem, isn't just fiction. It's a mirror. A mirror reflecting real struggles, real injustices, real fights that are happening every day. The question is, what would you have done? If you were in Aaliyah Carter's position, would you have fought the way she did? If you were Dalton, would you have justified your actions until the very end, or would you have changed before it was too late? Justice isn't always about grand victories. Sometimes, it's about standing firm when the world tells you to fall. It's about demanding to be heard when people want you silent. It's about refusing to let those in power define what's right and wrong for you. Now, I want to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? What would you have done differently? Do you believe justice was truly served? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you want more stories that challenge, that shake you, that make you think long after they're over, then subscribe to Tales of Twist and turn on notifications. Because trust me, there's more to come.